Chapter 279. September 15, 1898. Korean Peninsula, near Pyongyang. The rumble of artillery echoed heavily in the distance as the morning mist slowly lifted over the Yalu River Valley. General Yuan Shikai stood upon a hill overlooking the battlefield, scanning the enemy positions carefully through a pair of Amarathian-made field glasses. His staff stood quietly nearby, awaiting his instructions. After months of careful preparation and mobilization, the Chinese new army had finally arrived at the Korean front. Marching over difficult terrain to reinforce Russian positions in northern Korea, their objective was simple: break the Amarathian Japanese-Korean defensive line near Pyongyang and push swiftly southward toward Seoul. Linking with the Russian advance further east, General Yuan lowered the field glasses, calmly turning to his staff officers. Colonel Deng, report. Colonel Deng, a meticulous officer trained in modern military doctrine, stepped forward and snapped a quick salute. Sir, our scouts confirm that the Japanese 3rd Infantry Division and Amarathian 7th Expeditionary Brigade occupy entrenched positions on the ridge east of Pyongyang. They hold superior artillery positions, supported by multiple Maxim machine gun nests. Yuan nodded, unfazed. Their artillery strength? Approximately 24 field guns, mostly Amarathian 75mm quick-fire types, and roughly a dozen Japanese 90mm cannons positioned behind earthworks, difficult to assault directly. Casualty estimates for a frontal assault? High, sir, Deng admitted frankly, likely severe, unless we neutralize their artillery first. General Yuan turned toward Captain Liu, commander of his artillery units. Captain Liu, is our artillery battery fully deployed? Yes, sir, Captain Liu responded crisply. We have 36 modern Krupp 75mm guns, carefully concealed. Ammunition is ample. Yuan nodded slowly. He knew this battle would test the effectiveness of China's recent modernization. His soldiers had been meticulously trained by Amarathian advisors prior to hostilities, ironically enough. And now they'd be tested against their former mentors. Begin preliminary bombardment at precisely 0900 hours. Yuan ordered calmly. Target enemy artillery positions first, then the forward trenches. Understood, sir. Captain Liu saluted sharply and moved swiftly away to relay orders. Colonel Deng glanced back at Yuan carefully. An infantry deployment, sir? Deploy 2 regiments from the 3rd Division under General Feng. They will advance in disciplined skirmish lines behind the artillery barrage. Keep our reserves ready to exploit any gaps. Yes, sir, Deng replied confidently. 0900 hours, front lines precisely at 9 o'clock. The calm was shattered as dozens of Krupp 75mm guns erupted simultaneously, the thunderous blasts echoing sharply through the valley. Chinese artillery shells whistled overhead, smashing violently into Amarathian and Japanese positions, sending earth and debris skyward. The Amarathian gunners responded swiftly, their own guns roaring to life moments later, sending counter-battery fire back toward the concealed Chinese positions. Shells exploded along the ridge and valley floor, each detonation carving fresh scars into the earth. Amid the violent exchange of artillery fire, General Feng commanded the infantry forward, signaling precisely ordered movements with steady authority. The soldiers, clad in dark blue uniforms and armed with recently imported bolt-action rifles, advanced cautiously but determinedly. They moved in disciplined lines, using scattered cover, pausing only to fire accurately aimed volleys at distant enemy trenches. Amarathian Japanese defensive line, ridge east of Pyongyang. On the opposite ridge, Major Thomas Harper of the Amarathian 7th Expeditionary Brigade ducked instinctively as another Chinese shell exploded nearby, sending dirt and debris scattering through the air. Report. Harper barked, pulling himself up quickly. A lieutenant dashed toward him through the smoke-filled trench. Sir, Chinese infantry advancing steadily. Their artillery is targeting our batteries specifically. Casualties? Heavy damage to battery A. Sir, guns 1 and 3 disabled, multiple wounded. Harper scowled. Request immediate artillery reinforcement from headquarters. Hold this ridge at all costs. Yes, sir. Harper watched grimly as another shell landed near one of their remaining machine gun nests. Silencing it instantly, he cursed silently, realizing the Chinese were more capable than intelligence had indicated. These weren't outdated Qing forces. They fought with precision, using their modern artillery and infantry tactics effectively. 1030 hours, Chinese lines. General Yuan watched intently as his infantry approached the base of the ridge. The disciplined lines had been disrupted slightly by Amarathian artillery, but they remained coherent, rapidly closing the gap under heavy fire. He signaled a runner, instruct General Feng to commit reserves now, assault directly at the weakened western flank. The runner saluted sharply and rushed off. Yuan returned his attention to the unfolding battle, confident his tactics would yield results. He knew the cost was high, but decisive victory demanded sacrifice. 1,100 hours. Ridge defensive line. The Chinese infantry surged upward, bayonets fixed, rifles firing precise volleys at close range. Amorathian and Japanese troops, initially steady, began falling back in several spots under relentless pressure. Major Harper desperately shouted orders, trying to stabilize the collapsing flank. Hold your positions. Fix bayonets. Stand firm. But the momentum had shifted. Amorathian reinforcements from Pyongyang were delayed, and the Chinese, driven by rigorous training and sheer numbers, were breaking through. 1,300 hours later. General Yuan walked slowly through captured trenches, observing the cost of victory. Dead and wounded soldiers, Chinese, Japanese, Amorathian, lay scattered along the churned earth. Captured guns and machine guns were carefully catalogued by his staff. Colonel Deng approached respectfully. Sir, the ridge is secure. Enemy survivors are retreating toward Pyongyang. Our casualties around 500 dead and nearly 1,000 wounded. Enemy losses appear even higher. Yuan nodded slowly, expression stern. Make preparations for field hospitals immediately. Tend to all wounded, ours and theirs. This battle was decisive, but merely the beginning. Yes, sir. Send word to Russian command, Yuan continued, turning back toward his command tent. We have achieved initial objectives and will continue pressing southward. Ensure the men receive hot food and rest tonight. Tomorrow, we continue the advance. Understood, sir, Deng responded firmly, saluting. September 17, 1898, Amorathian headquarters, Seoul. In Seoul, Amorathian General William Caldwell slammed his fist onto a map table in frustration upon receiving the news. How could they break through? Our intelligence said the Chinese were poorly coordinated. Colonel Grant, his intelligence officer, responded grimly. General, they've clearly adapted rapidly. The Chinese troops utilized Amorathian tactics effectively. We underestimated their new training and discipline. Caldwell exhaled sharply, regaining composure. Prepare reinforcements immediately. Consolidate defensive positions around Pyongyang. If Pyongyang falls, Seoul becomes vulnerable. Sir, Colonel Grant spoke carefully. They've seized several artillery pieces and significant supplies from the ridge. Their next assault will be even stronger. Caldwell steadied himself, eyes narrowing coldly. Then we'll be ready for them. Coordinate with the Japanese High Command. The Chinese advance ends at Pyongyang. Understood? Understood, General, Grant replied firmly. September 18, 1898, Pyongyang front, Chinese lines. As dawn broke 2 days after their initial victory, General Yuan quietly studied maps, surrounded by his senior officers. His plan was meticulous. Encircle Pyongyang swiftly, cut enemy reinforcements from the south, and coordinate closely with the Russian push from the east. This next battle, Yuan addressed his officers firmly, is crucial. Pyongyang will not fall easily. But it is the key to controlling northern Korea. Our artillery must again be decisive. Infantry must hold discipline and use terrain wisely. The officers nodded solemnly. Yuan continued calmly. Our enemies have been forced onto the defensive. Do not underestimate them. They will fight desperately. Colonel Deng stepped forward. Sir, what of the Amorathian threat to embargo our supplies? Our troops rely heavily on their imports. Yuan replied with confidence. Our Russian allies are already working to provide alternatives. Until then, use captured weapons, ammunition, and equipment from battles. Conserve supplies carefully. Yes, sir, Deng acknowledged. Yuan looked around his assembled commanders, noting their determined expressions. The new army represents China's renewed strength. Today, we demonstrate that strength clearly to our enemies. He stepped back, straightened his uniform, and issued the final command: begin the assault on Pyongyang. The Chinese forces marched forward again, well-drilled and resolute, their path determined and unyielding. The battles ahead promised heavy costs and uncertain outcomes, but China was finally on the march on empire, determined to reclaim its place. Regardless of the price, as artillery fire erupted once more, shaking the Korean earth, the struggle for East Asia surged into a new, relentless phase. September 18, 1898, outskirts of Pyongyang as Chinese forces pressed onward. Artillery rounds again screamed overhead, pounding Pyongyang's defensive positions. The city, strategically critical, sat nestled behind layered defenses hastily reinforced by Amorathian engineers. Trenches, barbed wire entanglements, and fortified machine gun nests lined the approaches, waiting grimly for the impending Chinese assault. At the leading edge of Yuan Shirkai's forces, General Feng studied the defenses through binoculars. Nearby, his men prepared ladders, grenades, and wire cutters for the imminent assault. Feng turned to his adjutant, order 2nd and 3rd companies forward, concentrate machine gun fire on enemy strongpoints, follow immediately with bayonet assault. Understood, sir. Within moments, disciplined lines of Chinese infantry surged forward again. Rifle fire crackled in sharp volleys, carefully coordinated to suppress Amorathian and Japanese positions. Maxim guns captured from earlier battles rattled out bursts. Cutting into enemy trenches, soldiers surged onward, throwing grenades methodically to clear defensive pockets, storming through the smoky, chaotic battlefield. In Pyongyang, Amorathian Major Harper, exhausted and bloodied from earlier fighting, barked commands to reorganize defenders amid relentless pressure, reinforce the northern trenches, request immediate artillery support. A Japanese lieutenant shouted back urgently, "Sir, enemy artillery destroyed our forward observation posts. Artillery support is blind." Harper clenched his jaw in frustration, watching helplessly as another wave of Chinese soldiers advanced toward their weakened positions. Without artillery support, Pyongyang's defenses strained dangerously, threatening total collapse at the Chinese command post. General Yuan observed carefully through binoculars, recognizing the enemy's confusion. Turning decisively to Colonel Deng, he said, "Commit the reserves now, exploit their disorganization fully. Pyongyang must fall today." "Yes, sir." Deng snapped sharply, signaling runners immediately. Within an hour, fresh Chinese battalions poured forward, relentlessly exploiting every weak point along Pyongyang's battered defenses. With ammunition low, morale faltering, and leadership strained, defenders began a slow, grudging withdrawal toward the city's heart. As night fell on September 18th, Chinese forces firmly secured Pyongyang's outskirts, their banners proudly flying over captured Amorathian positions. General Yuan Shirkai allowed himself a quiet, brief moment of satisfaction. Pyongyang was within reach, and the path southward toward Seoul lay open, awaiting conquest. Chapter 280. September 19, 1898. Pyongyang, northern defensive perimeter. The morning broke cold and misty over Pyongyang. Thick fog lingered stubbornly across the muddy fields, obscuring enemy positions and making artillery spotting nearly impossible. Despite this, Chinese forces continued their push toward the city's fortified northern defensive perimeter. Aiming to capitalize on their recent gains, General Yuan Shirkai observed the battlefield from a forward command post surrounded by hastily erected sandbag walls and guarded by riflemen in trenches nearby. The damp air carried distant echoes of intermittent gunfire as both sides exchanged sporadic rifle shots through the fog. Colonel Deng approached swiftly, saluting, "Sir, recon patrols report heavy fortifications ahead." Amorathian engineers spent the night reinforcing positions along the Taidong riverbank. They are constructing secondary defensive lines within Pyongyang itself. Yuan acknowledged calmly, studying a tactical map laid out before him. Their commander, General Caldwell, is skilled. He knows the city is vital. What about enemy artillery strength? Deng gestured to marked positions. They repositioned several batteries overnight, including some heavier Amorathian 105mm howitzers. They are protecting supply lines into the city from the south and west. Yuan considered carefully. Capturing Pyongyang quickly was imperative. Any delay risked giving the enemy time to regroup and reinforce. Our artillery? Captain Liu repositioned our batteries under darkness, Deng reported promptly. 32 guns operational. Ammunition remains sufficient, but replenishment will become an issue in several days. Understood, Yuan responded decisively. Commence artillery barrage at 0700 hours. Target enemy forward positions and attempt to disrupt their engineer units. Immediately afterward, infantry regiments will assault. Yes, sir, Deng saluted sharply, moving to relay orders. 0700 hours. Pyongyang northern outskirts. Chinese artillery unleashed a thunderous barrage precisely as ordered. Shells screaming overhead and crashing violently into Amorathian defensive positions. Explosions tore through hastily constructed bunkers, collapsing sandbagged trenches and causing chaos among the enemy troops attempting last-minute fortifications. Amorathian defenders scrambled for cover, desperately trying to restore order. Amid falling shells, machine gun positions returned sporadic fire, attempting to suppress the approaching infantry lines. General Feng, commanding the infantry assault, shouted orders clearly and methodically. Soldiers advanced steadily under the protection of artillery cover, skirmish lines maintaining formation, firing carefully coordinated rifle volleys as they closed distance. However, Amorathian resistance stiffened sharply as Chinese infantry approached within 200 meters. Machine Guns hidden in fortified bunkers opened relentless fire, cutting down advancing soldiers. Casualties quickly mounted. Chinese forward lines General Yuan, observing from his position, noticed immediately the infantry's slowed progress. He signaled a runner, urgently delivering new orders: shift artillery fire directly to enemy machine gun emplacements. Support infantry advance closely. The runner sprinted off, and within minutes the artillery barrage shifted dramatically. Accurate shells detonated directly upon enemy bunkers, temporarily silencing machine gun fire. Taking advantage of the brief lull, Chinese soldiers surged forward again, rapidly closing the gap. Pyongyang, Amerathian defensive lines. Major Thomas Harper watched in frustration as artillery shells pummeled his carefully prepared defenses. Artillery spotters, he shouted through the chaos. Get counterbattery. Fire online immediately. Impossible, sir, shouted a young lieutenant, ducking as another shell exploded nearby. We lost sight lines in this damned fog. Harper cursed quietly, gripping his revolver tightly. He knew the defensive line wouldn't hold much longer without artillery support. 0900 hours, Chinese assault breach finally. The relentless Chinese infantry overwhelmed a critical sector of the northern defenses, pouring into trenches and overrunning isolated Amerathian positions. Fierce close-quarter fighting erupted, bayonets and rifle butts clashing brutally. Amerathian soldiers, vastly outnumbered, began retreating into secondary defensive lines deeper within Pyongyang. General Yuan watched intently, satisfaction tempered by caution. The city remained stubbornly defended, and casualties on both sides were mounting rapidly. September 20th, 1898. Seoul. Amerathian Headquarters General Caldwell reviewed the desperate reports filtering in from Pyongyang. Recognizing the city's dire situation, reinforcements from the south were delayed, and morale among remaining defenders teetered dangerously low. Colonel Grant entered swiftly. General, Japanese High Command advises immediate withdrawal to stronger defensive positions southward. Holding Pyongyang any longer risks losing our remaining forces. Caldwell clenched his fist bitterly, knowing Grant was correct. Issue immediate withdrawal orders, he said reluctantly. Destroy any equipment we cannot evacuate. We cannot allow the Chinese to seize more supplies. Understood, Grant replied firmly, moving swiftly to issue orders. September 21st, 1898. Pyongyang. Early morning as dawn illuminated battered Pyongyang. Chinese troops cautiously advanced through the city's outskirts. Encountering little resistance, Amerathian and Japanese forces had evacuated overnight, destroying bridges, ammunition stores, and heavy equipment. As they withdrew, General Yuan Shirkai entered the city solemnly, observing scorched buildings, abandoned trenches, and scattered debris. Colonel Deng approached quietly. The city is ours, General. Enemy forces withdrew during the night. They demolished key infrastructure to slow our advance southward. Yuan nodded slowly. Casualties? Deng hesitated briefly. Hi, sir. Another 800 dead. Over 1,500 wounded. Medical units overwhelmed. Yuan exhaled slowly. The cost of victory was steep but necessary. Begin immediate repairs to infrastructure, prioritize clearing roads, and restoring communication lines with Russian forces to the east. Pyongyang must become our forward base for further operations. Understood, sir, Deng replied respectfully. September 23, 1898. Pyongyang. Chinese Command Center 2 days later. Yuan reviewed updated strategic maps alongside Russian commanders who had arrived from the Eastern Front. Russian General Alexei Mikhailov spoke grimly. Your forces have done remarkably, General. Yuan. Pyongyang is vital, but enemy forces are regrouping further south near Seoul. Amerathian naval units are reinforcing coastal positions. We must act quickly before they regain full strength. Yuan nodded, aware the coming weeks would test his troops even further. Agreed. Prepare a combined offensive toward Seoul immediately. Coordinate closely our forces attacking from the north. Yours from the east. We must keep pressure constant. Mikhailov acknowledged solemnly. Our forces will be ready, General. Together, we will ensure victory. Yuan stepped away briefly, looking across the battered city. The captured city symbolized a significant step, but the war was far from finished. Seoul awaited, heavily fortified and well defended. He turned decisively back toward the gathered officers, voice steady with determination. Prepare the men immediately. Let every soldier understand clearly this victory at Pyongyang was merely the start. Seoul will be even more challenging, demanding greater sacrifice and resolve. Officers saluted crisply, dispersing to issue orders. General Yuan stood quietly, staring southward where distant battles loomed. The Chinese Empire had proved its strength at Pyongyang, but the struggle for East Asia was only beginning. As Chinese forces readied themselves once more, the relentless conflict surged inexorably forward, each victory costly, each battle hard-fought, and each soldier knowing clearly that the decisive fight for dominance in East Asia was yet to come. September 24, 1898. D.C., Amarathia Presidential Palace. The early evening sunlight cast long shadows through the tall windows of the presidential study, reflecting gently off polished mahogany surfaces and neatly arranged papers. President Matthew Hesh stood by his desk, silently reviewing telegram reports from the front. The latest dispatches had painted a worrying picture for days, but the report he held now confirmed his deepest fears. A hesitant knock sounded at the door, interrupting Matthew's grim thoughts. "Come in," Matthew called quietly, without turning from the report. The door opened smoothly, and Collins entered, his face carefully neutral yet betraying the gravity of the situation. "Mr. President, we've just received confirmation. Pyongyang has fallen to Chinese forces," Collins reported solemnly. Standing stiffly just inside the door, General Caldwell ordered an evacuation after intense fighting. "Our units are now regrouping south of the city." Matthew exhaled slowly, carefully placing the telegram onto his desk. For a moment, he did not reply, staring silently out toward the fading sunlight that bathed the city below in a deceptively peaceful glow. "Casualties?" he finally asked. His voice tightly controlled, heavy. Collins admitted carefully, "The reports indicate significant losses, particularly among the Japanese 3rd Infantry and our own 7th Expeditionary Brigade. Ammunition, heavy artillery, and supplies were left behind or destroyed to prevent enemy capture. Morale among troops is low." Matthew nodded grimly, absorbing the painful details. "General Caldwell's status?" "Alive, uninjured, and currently supervising the withdrawal southward," Collins answered promptly. "He has requested immediate reinforcements and additional supplies, particularly artillery ammunition." Matthew turned slowly toward Collins, his expression sober. "Authorize the reinforcements immediately." "Collins, pull what we can from reserve units stationed at our bases in Busan. We must stabilize the front before Chinese forces reach Seoul." "Yes, Mr. President," Collins responded crisply, "and the Japanese High Command has also requested an urgent meeting. They are deeply concerned about the deteriorating situation and the threat it poses to their home islands." Matthew moved slowly back toward his desk, his thoughts racing. The loss of Pyongyang was a blow strategically significant and symbolically troubling. The city had been a defensive linchpin in the northern theater. Its fall would embolden Chinese and Russian forces, making the defense of Seoul far more complicated. "Arrange a meeting with the Japanese ambassador tonight," Matthew instructed firmly. "Inform him I will personally oversee the coordination of military strategy between our nations. Japan must understand clearly that Amarathia remains fully committed to this alliance." Collins acknowledged promptly, recognizing the urgency. "I'll see to it immediately, sir." As Collins turned to leave, Matthew raised a hand slightly, stopping him. "And Collins, also prepare an address for the nation. The people deserve clarity and reassurance during these difficult moments. Let them hear directly from me that Amarathia will not falter regardless of setbacks." Collins nodded solemnly. "Of course, sir." Chapter 281. September 28, 1898. Seoul, Amarathian Korean Joint Command Center. It was early morning in Seoul, and the sun was just starting to rise above the distant hills. General William Caldwell stood around a large table with maps sprawled across its surface. He looked tired, worn down by weeks of relentless fighting and constant setbacks. Around him stood officers from the Japanese Imperial Army, the Korean Royal Army, and his own Amarathian staff, each quietly waiting for Caldwell to speak. "All right, everyone," Caldwell finally began, his voice steady and focused. "We've had a tough couple of weeks. Losing Pyongyang was hard, no question about it, but we can't dwell on that now. We need to start looking forward." He gestured at the maps, tracing a finger along the main route south from Pyongyang. "Chinese forces under General Yuan Shikai are preparing for a major push southward. They'll be trying to take Seoul quickly. If we lose Seoul, this war could end badly, fast." Colonel Grant stepped forward. "Reinforcements from Busan are arriving now, General. The Amarathian 9th and 11th Infantry Divisions are already mobilized, and we've received substantial artillery ammunition and supplies. We'll have enough to hold the line and, more importantly, to counterattack." General Caldwell nodded, clearly encouraged. Good news, but remember, we're not fighting alone. Our Japanese allies are regrouping just east of Seoul, near Chuncheon. General Okada, how are your preparations? General Haruto Okada, a respected figure within the Japanese Imperial Army, moved closer to the table. He spoke carefully, his voice firm and clear. Our forces have regrouped successfully after the Pyongyang withdrawal. 2 full divisions of infantry supported by artillery and cavalry have arrived. We are ready to hold the eastern flank, then counterattack when the opportunity arises. Caldwell nodded again, satisfied. Excellent. And General Lee? General Lee Sang-hoon, commander of the Korean Royal Army, spoke up next. Our units have reinforced defensive positions along the Imjin River. We've dug trenches and positioned heavy artillery. The morale of my men remains high despite recent setbacks. They understand clearly the stakes involved. Caldwell looked around at the assembled officers. Good, here's the plan. We'll stop the Chinese advance north of Seoul along the Imjin River. Once they're halted, we'll launch a coordinated counterattack from the east and west, aiming to cut off Yuan's forces from their supply lines near Pyongyang. He paused briefly, ensuring everyone followed his words closely. General Okada, your divisions will push aggressively from Chuncheon, attacking Yuan's eastern flank. At the same time, Ameranthian and Korean forces under my direct command will counterattack from the west and center. The key objective is to encircle the Chinese troops and isolate them from their reinforcements. If we succeed, we'll regain the initiative and have a shot at retaking Pyongyang. General Okada nodded confidently. Understood. We will move aggressively as ordered. General Lee similarly saluted, speaking clearly. The Korean army will hold our positions at any cost and assist fully in the counterattack. Caldwell looked around the room one final time, noting the determination in each officer's eyes. All right then, gentlemen, let's get to it. We strike back tomorrow at dawn. Dismissed. September 29, 1898, early morning. Imjin River defensive line. The sky was just turning pale gray when the first artillery shells screamed overhead. Chinese artillery, positioned just north of the Imjin River, opened fire with heavy bombardments aimed at Ameranthian Korean defensive positions along the riverbanks. Dirt and debris exploded into the air, shaking the ground violently. In their trenches, Ameranthian and Korean soldiers waited anxiously, clutching rifles tightly. The tension was palpable as shells continued to fall relentlessly around them. Officers shouted orders, urging troops to remain calm and steady despite the deafening noise. After 30 long minutes of bombardment, the shells suddenly stopped. A moment of eerie silence followed. Soldiers tensed, knowing exactly what came next. Then, from the distant hills and fields beyond the river, Chinese infantry surged forward in massive, disciplined waves. Soldiers in dark blue uniforms advanced quickly, rifles at the ready, supported by machine guns and light artillery firing from behind their lines. Hold your fire, shouted Captain Edward Harris, commander of the Ameranthian 24th Infantry Regiment, crouched low in the trenches. His voice carried clearly through the ranks. Wait until they're close. The Chinese infantry approached quickly, crossing the open fields in precise formations. At 200 meters, they opened fire in coordinated volleys, sending bullets whistling overhead or thudding into trench walls. Fire, Harris shouted finally, raising his rifle and aiming carefully. Instantly, hundreds of Ameranthian and Korean rifles opened up simultaneously, unleashing a deadly barrage of gunfire. The Chinese advance immediately slowed as soldiers fell, but their momentum still carried them forward. Machine guns positioned along the trenches rattled violently, mowing down advancing infantry in grim bursts. Still, the Chinese pressed forward, determined and relentless, closing distance rapidly. Fix bayonets, Harris ordered urgently. Soldiers along the line quickly obeyed, attaching sharp bayonets to their rifles. The fighting was about to get very close, very brutal. Within moments, Chinese soldiers reached the trenches, leaping inside and engaging in savage close-quarter combat. Rifle butt smashed brutally, bayonets stabbed desperately, and hand-to-hand fighting erupted everywhere along the defensive line. Harris himself grappled with a young Chinese soldier, eventually forcing the man down into the muddy trench floor. To the east, General Okada's Japanese divisions struck exactly as planned, launching a ferocious assault on the Chinese eastern flank. Artillery blasted enemy positions relentlessly, and disciplined infantry advanced methodically, pushing back Chinese troops caught off guard by the sudden Japanese attack. Caught between the fierce defensive resistance at the Imjin River and the aggressive Japanese assault from Chuncheon, Chinese commanders quickly realized their predicament. They attempted to regroup, repositioning reserves hastily. But the coordinated Allied offensive severely disrupted their movements. September 29, 1898, noon Amarathian headquarters. Seoul. General Caldwell watched reports flow into headquarters with cautious optimism. "It's working," he muttered, mostly to himself. "We've got them off balance." Colonel Grant approached, smiling briefly for the first time in days. "Reports from General Okada indicate major progress on the eastern flank. Japanese forces have already captured key villages and positions. Our men along the Imjin River are also holding firm despite heavy casualties." Caldwell exhaled slowly, allowing a brief moment of relief. "Good. Now comes the critical phase. Send immediate orders to General Lee and Captain Harris. Begin pushing aggressively northward. If we don't give the Chinese time to reorganize, we can encircle a major portion of Yuan's forces and regain significant territory." "Right away, sir," Grant replied confidently, quickly drafting new orders. September 30, 1898, afternoon northern outskirts of Seoul. After nearly 2 full days of fierce combat, the Allied counterattack began showing clear results. Japanese divisions under Okada pushed deeper into the eastern flank, capturing critical supply routes and cutting off multiple Chinese regiments at the same time. Amarathian and Korean troops successfully repulsed repeated Chinese assaults along the Imjin River and started advancing northward. General Yuan Shikai, sensing the threat of encirclement, began reluctantly ordering Chinese units to withdraw north toward Pyongyang, trying desperately to regroup and prevent total disaster. October 1, 1898, D.C., Amarathia Presidential Palace. President Matthew Hesh read the latest telegram from Seoul, breathing deeply with relief. For the first time in days, the counterattack was succeeding, pushing Chinese forces back and stabilizing the Korean theater. It wasn't a decisive victory yet, but it was a turning point, crucially reversing recent setbacks. Collins knocked gently, entering with a cautious smile. "Good news, sir." Matthew nodded slowly, allowing himself a small smile. "Good enough for now. They've stopped Yuan's advance and forced him back toward Pyongyang." Collins visibly relaxed. "Then your orders are working, sir." Matthew stood slowly, looking out at the city below, determined. "They've bought us some breathing room. Now it's up to us to ensure this counterattack isn't temporary. Inform General Caldwell that Amarathia is fully committed. Whatever he needs, he'll have it." Collins nodded solemnly, sensing clearly the resolve in Matthew's voice. "Right away, sir." As Matthew returned his gaze to the maps spread across his desk, he knew clearly this war was far from over, but for the first time since the loss of Pyongyang, he felt genuine hope that victory was possible. October 2, 1898. Early morning, outskirts of Kaesong, northern front. Under a gray and overcast sky, Captain Edward Harris led his battered Amarathian troops forward alongside Korean infantry units. Their objective was Kaesong, a key supply hub between Seoul and Pyongyang. Despite exhaustion, morale was rising as soldiers recognized the enemy was now retreating. Harris moved quickly among his men, keeping them focused. "Stay alert. They may be retreating, but they're not beaten yet," Harris warned firmly. As they neared Kaesong, sporadic rifle fire erupted from Chinese rear guards trying desperately to slow the advancing Allied forces. Amarathian and Korean troops returned fire immediately, steadily pressing forward. Back in Seoul, General Caldwell received fresh reports confirming steady progress on all fronts. Japanese forces under Okada had advanced rapidly from Chuncheon, forcing Chinese units further westward and leaving them vulnerable to encirclement. Caldwell allowed himself another brief moment of satisfaction before quickly issuing further orders. "Tell Captain Harris and General Lee to push on Kaesong immediately. Securing it quickly will cripple Yuan's supply line to Pyongyang." Grant nodded sharply, scribbling the orders swiftly. Meanwhile, in Kaesong itself, Chinese units frantically destroyed supplies and munitions they couldn't carry north. Smoke rose from ammunition stores, and roads were littered with abandoned artillery pieces and wagons. Harris's troops pressed relentlessly, capturing key positions block by block as resistance faded steadily. By nightfall, Amarathian and Korean troops finally secured Kaesong, taking hundreds of prisoners and critical supplies. Harris stood silently amid the burning rubble, exhausted yet relieved. Their momentum had decisively shifted. In D.C., Matthew Hesh quietly reviewed new telegrams detailing the success at Kaesong. For the first time since Pyongyang fell, victory felt within reach, a tangible reality now driving Amarathian and Allied troops northward once more. Chapter 282. October 3, 1898 Pyongyang, Chinese-Russian Joint Command Center. General Yuan Shikai paced the wooden floors of his temporary headquarters, a commandeered mansion overlooking Pyongyang's central district. The atmosphere inside was tense, thick with cigarette smoke and the grim silence of exhausted officers. Maps and reports lay scattered across tables and desks, each detailing the disastrous setbacks of the last few days. The swift and decisive Ameranthian-Japanese-Korean counterattack had severely disrupted Yuan's carefully planned offensive, and now his troops had been forced to retreat back toward Pyongyang. The doors opened abruptly, and Russian General Alexei Mikhailov entered swiftly, his face darkened with frustration. "General Yuan," he began sharply, "we must act immediately. The enemy forces have retaken Kaesong, cutting our southern supply lines. Your withdrawal has compromised our eastern flank as well." Yuan stopped pacing, turning calmly to face the Russian officer. He knew precisely what this confrontation meant: growing tension between the Allied forces under immense pressure. He chose his words carefully, his tone measured and firm. "General Mikhailov," Yuan said deliberately, "my troops have done everything possible under extraordinarily difficult conditions. Ameranthian reinforcements were greater and faster than anticipated. The responsibility for the setback is not ours alone." Mikhailov's eyes narrowed slightly, but he softened his voice, recognizing the delicate nature of their alliance. "I'm not assigning blame, General Yuan, but we must consolidate our defenses immediately. Ameranthian and Japanese forces are now poised to march directly on Pyongyang. If they succeed, the entire northern Korean front collapses." Yuan exhaled slowly, aware of the stakes. He gestured toward a strategic map pinned to the wall, tracing defensive lines around the city. "Our remaining divisions will fortify defensive positions around Pyongyang. I've ordered the 2nd and 5th Divisions to construct new trenches and earthworks on the southern and eastern approaches. We have sufficient artillery ammunition and reserves to hold a prolonged siege." "Artillery alone won't be enough," Mikhailov replied firmly. "Our troops are demoralized from the rapid withdrawal, and the enemy's morale is clearly surging. We need immediate reinforcements and fresh supplies from our northern depots. Without additional troops, we risk losing everything we've gained." Yuan considered carefully. "Additional reinforcements from Beijing and Vladivostok are already en route," he finally admitted, though reluctantly. "They will arrive within 10 days. Until then, we must rely on defensive tactics and guerrilla actions to slow the Ameranthian advance." Mikhailov stepped forward, studying the map closely. "We can still blunt their momentum if we act decisively. I'll deploy my available infantry divisions west of Pyongyang, engaging their flank as soon as they move northward. It might delay their main attack long enough for your reinforcements to arrive." Yuan nodded in agreement. "My cavalry regiments will conduct raids and harassment operations along their supply lines near Kaesong. If we can disrupt their supplies and communication, we may yet regain some advantage." Both generals stared silently at the map for a long moment, each knowing clearly that these actions might only delay the inevitable, but delay was precisely what they needed most. October 4th, 1898 Kaesong. Ameranthian Korean Joint Operations Base in Kaesong, Captain Edward Harris and General Lee Sang-hoon quickly transformed the captured city into a bustling forward base. Ameranthian engineers repaired roads, cleared debris, and fortified strategic points against potential Chinese counterattacks. Medical tents overflowed with wounded soldiers from both sides, while quartermasters hurriedly catalogued captured supplies and munitions. General Caldwell arrived in Kaesong late in the afternoon, escorted by his personal staff. He immediately sought out Harris and Lee to coordinate the next phase of their advance toward Pyongyang. "Gentlemen," Caldwell began firmly, "this victory at Kaesong is critical. We've disrupted their southern supply line, but the Chinese and Russians won't remain passive. Our next move must be decisive. What's your current situation?" Captain Harris spoke first, straightening slightly despite visible fatigue. "Sir, we've secured Kaesong completely. Our troops are rested, though ammunition and supplies remain tight. However, we've captured substantial quantities of enemy artillery and munitions. We'll be able to resupply somewhat from their own stores." Caldwell nodded approvingly. "Good, General Lee?" Lee stepped forward, his uniform still dusted with dirt and grime from the previous day's fighting. "My men are eager to push forward. The Korean troops have high morale after retaking our territory, and we're ready to continue north immediately." Caldwell unfolded a detailed map on the makeshift table, pointing decisively at their next objectives. "We'll advance in 2 primary columns. Harris, your Ameranthian infantry will push directly north along the main route toward Pyongyang. General Lee, your Korean units will flank westward, aiming to isolate any Chinese or Russian forces attempting to threaten our western flank." Both officers nodded sharply, clearly understanding the stakes and the strategy. October 5, 1898 near Sariwan, northern advance before dawn the next day, Amorathian and Korean troops resumed their northward advance. Captain Harris led the main column, his infantry moving steadily along the road north from Kaesong. Despite occasional sniper fire and skirmishes with enemy scouts, the advance proceeded methodically, bolstered by artillery support carefully positioned along their line of march. General Lee's Korean troops moved swiftly westward, their lighter infantry units engaging in frequent small-scale clashes with Chinese cavalry attempting harassment tactics. Lee personally led several mounted patrols, aggressively pursuing and scattering enemy cavalry detachments. Further east, Japanese forces under General Okada maintained relentless pressure against Russian positions, preventing Mikhailov from effectively repositioning forces westward. This ensured the Amorathian Korean columns advanced with minimal interference, rapidly approaching the critical city of Sariwan, another key defensive and logistical hub halfway between Kaesong and Pyongyang. By midday, forward scouts reported significant enemy defenses hastily erected around Sariwan. Harris and Lee quickly coordinated artillery bombardments, targeting enemy fortifications precisely. As shells exploded violently across enemy trenches and defensive positions, Amorathian and Korean infantry surged forward, decisively, rapidly closing the distance. Heavy fighting erupted throughout the afternoon, with enemy soldiers resisting stubbornly despite artillery bombardments. Harris personally led repeated infantry charges against entrenched Chinese positions, finally breaking through key points late in the evening. By sunset, Sariwan's defenses had largely collapsed, enemy troops retreating in disarray toward Pyongyang. October 6, 1898 Amorathia Presidential Palace, D.C. Matthew Hesh read new telegrams from Korea quietly, feeling cautious optimism rising again. Collins entered, sensing Matthew's mood immediately. More good news, sir? Collins asked carefully. Matthew nodded, still cautious. They've taken Sariwan. The Chinese retreat toward Pyongyang continues. Collins smiled briefly, relieved. Then our troops have momentum. Momentum indeed, Matthew agreed slowly, but Yuan Shirkai won't surrender easily. Pyongyang will be the decisive fight. Collins nodded solemnly, recognizing the truth. Do you need anything else, sir? Matthew shook his head slightly, eyes focused sharply. Just continue providing whatever Caldwell and our allies require. This war isn't over yet, but we're finally winning. Collins quietly exited, leaving Matthew to reflect silently. Each success brought him closer to securing lasting peace, but Pyongyang loomed. A heat of fierce battle awaited, demanding greater courage and sacrifice than any before. Chapter 283. October 8, 1898 Northern outskirts of Pyongyang. Dawn arrived with a grim, hazy light over the outskirts of Pyongyang. Clouds gathered low, hanging oppressively over the muddy fields and hastily constructed earthworks that surrounded the embattled city. The once proud capital now stood defiant, but scarred, smoke from smoldering buildings still drifting into the air, marking the city's suffering over weeks of relentless conflict. Captain Edward Harris adjusted his binoculars, squinting to get a clear view of the enemy lines. From his position atop a low hill, he could see Chinese troops hurriedly digging trenches and fortifying their defenses. Artillery pieces had been positioned strategically, aimed directly toward the advancing Amorathian and Korean forces. Looks like they're ready for us, Harris muttered, more to himself than anyone else. His adjutant, Lieutenant James Carter, nodded grimly beside him. General Caldwell said Pyongyang will be tougher than Kaesong, sir. Carter noted quietly, handing over an updated tactical map. They've got better positions and plenty of ammunition. Russian units are reportedly bolstering their lines as well. Harris sighed deeply. They'll fight like hell to hold the city. Losing Pyongyang means losing control of the entire northern front. This won't be easy. Behind them, Amorathian infantrymen and Korean soldiers quickly established forward positions, digging shallow trenches and stacking sandbags. Artillery crews carefully positioned their cannons, preparing for a sustained bombardment that would soften the enemy's defenses before the infantry assault. Further east, General Okada's Japanese divisions closed rapidly, forming a wide arc around the city. The coordination was deliberate. Pyongyang needed to be completely encircled if the Allied forces hoped to fully regain control of northern Korea. October 9, 1898, early morning. Chinese-Russian headquarters, central Pyongyang. General Yuan Shirkai stood silently in a second-floor office of the commandeered mansion, staring out over his defenses. The previous days had allowed him to prepare Pyongyang extensively. Trenches, barbed wire entanglements, fortified bunkers, and carefully placed artillery created formidable defenses. But even as Yuan reviewed the situation, doubt nagged him fiercely. His forces were battle-weary, morale was wavering, and reinforcements from Beijing and Vladivostok had yet to arrive. Russian General Alexei Mikhailov entered the room quietly, sensing Yuan's uncertainty. "Our western defenses are ready, General," he reported in a calm, measured voice. "We've positioned machine guns and artillery to maximize casualties among attackers." Yuan nodded slowly. "Good. Amorathian and Japanese forces will try to break through quickly. Knowing our reinforcements are delayed, we must hold out long enough." Mikhailov stepped closer, his voice firm but tempered by realism. "The men are exhausted, General. If we don't receive support soon, even the strongest defenses won't hold indefinitely." Yuan turned, his expression resolute despite deep fatigue. "Our orders are clear, General Mikhailov. Pyongyang must hold. If this city falls, Beijing and Vladivostok will be next." The Russian nodded soberly. "Understood, General. We'll fight to the last." October 9, 1898. New northern approaches to Pyongyang. The Allied artillery bombardment began precisely at noon. Roaring to life with a fierce intensity, dozens of Amorathian and Korean cannons thundered simultaneously, shells arcing high overhead before exploding violently among the enemy trenches and bunkers. The ground shook from continuous detonations, dirt and debris blasted skyward with every hit. Captain Harris watched the barrage closely, his heart pounding in his chest. When the artillery briefly ceased firing to adjust targets, Harris gave a sharp nod to Lieutenant Carter. "Advance!" Infantry units surged forward immediately, crossing open ground swiftly toward enemy lines. Rifle fire erupted from Chinese and Russian positions, bullets snapping through the air, cutting down several advancing soldiers. But Harris's men pressed onward, using the terrain to minimize casualties as best they could. Machine guns positioned along the enemy lines opened fire, sending deadly streams of bullets slicing across the battlefield. Soldiers fell left and right. Yet still, the Amorathian and Korean troops closed the gap rapidly, diving into enemy trenches amid savage close-quarter fighting. Captain Harris vaulted into a trench, landing awkwardly but recovering quickly. He aimed his rifle and fired instinctively at enemy soldiers scrambling desperately to repel the attack. Rifle fire crackled sharply, bayonets flashed, and shouts echoed along the trench lines as fierce combat erupted everywhere at once. October 9, 1898. Afternoon Eastern Flank. Pyongyang simultaneously. General Okada led Japanese troops in aggressive attacks on the eastern perimeter. His disciplined infantry quickly overwhelmed enemy positions weakened by earlier bombardments. Artillery support continued, accurately striking Russian defensive lines attempting to stabilize the eastern front. By late afternoon, Okada's forces managed to capture several critical artillery emplacements, dramatically reducing enemy firepower. He quickly signaled Caldwell in the west, urging an immediate push to capitalize on their gains. October 9, 1898. Evening Chinese-Russian headquarters. Pyongyang reports flooded into the mansion serving as Yuan's command center, each one detailing increasingly dire news. Yuan listened silently, his face pale but determined. "Our eastern defenses have collapsed," an aide reported urgently. "Japanese forces have captured key artillery positions. The western trenches are barely holding under constant Amorathian assaults." Yuan stood slowly, absorbing the heavy news. "Fall back to secondary defensive positions within the city. We must make every street and building costly for them." General Mikhailov nodded solemnly. "Understood, General. My troops will hold as long as possible." October 10, 1898. Early morning Western Pyongyang Allied forces pressed deeper into Pyongyang, capturing positions street by street. Captain Harris led his men methodically through burning buildings and rubble-filled streets, rifle fire echoing constantly. Harris himself narrowly escaped injury multiple times, pushing relentlessly forward despite exhaustion. General Caldwell established a temporary forward command post in the city's western outskirts, receiving constant updates. The fighting was brutal, but Pyongyang was slowly slipping from enemy control. "Tell Harris and Lee to maintain pressure," Caldwell ordered sharply. "We cannot give them a chance to regroup." October 11, 1898. Afternoon Pyongyang. Central Plaza. After 2 full days of relentless fighting, Allied forces finally reached Pyongyang's Central Plaza, capturing the heart of the city after intense combat. Yuan and Mikhailov reluctantly ordered a general withdrawal, desperately attempting to preserve their remaining forces as they retreated northward. Captain Harris stood wearily in the plaza, surveying the devastated city. Smoke and flames rose from countless buildings, and debris littered every street. The cost of victory was painfully evident, but the strategic gain was monumental. General Caldwell arrived soon after, shaking Harris's hand firmly. "Excellent work, Captain," he said solemnly, eyes heavy with respect. "Pyongyang is ours again, thanks to you and your men." Harris nodded, exhaustion mingling with pride. "They fought incredibly hard, sir, but we got it done." Caldwell exhaled slowly, knowing clearly what lay ahead. "It's a huge step, Captain, but the fight isn't over yet. Yuan and Mikhailov are retreating northward, and they'll regroup. We'll pursue immediately." "Understood, sir," Harris replied firmly. As twilight settled over the battered city, Caldwell turned toward the horizon, knowing the next stage of the war would be equally harsh. But the victory at Pyongyang marked a turning point, one that could shift the course of the entire conflict. For the first time since the war's outset, victory felt truly attainable. Chapter 284. October 12, 1898. Northern Pyongyang outskirts. The morning sky was a dull gray, heavy clouds casting a gloom over the recently liberated city of Pyongyang. Smoke still drifted slowly upward from ruined buildings and smoldering artillery craters, creating a grim backdrop as Ameranthian, Korean, and Japanese troops quickly reorganized after the brutal battle. Soldiers moved hastily among temporary tents and makeshift command posts, clearing debris and collecting the wounded. Captain Edward Harris stood beside General Caldwell in a hastily established forward command tent just north of the city. Maps spread across a long table detailed the surrounding region, with red markers indicating enemy positions retreating steadily northward. "We've confirmed General Yuan Shirkai's forces are falling back to defensive positions around Unju, roughly 50 kilometers north," Colonel Grant reported, pointing directly at a marked town along the Chongchan River. "They've abandoned large quantities of artillery and supplies during their retreat, but they're regrouping quickly and digging in for another stand." Caldwell studied the map intently. "We can't afford to give them much time to recover," he said firmly. "We must maintain pressure. The enemy is demoralized but not yet broken. Another decisive strike could cripple their northern front entirely." Captain Harris stepped closer to the map, his face showing the strain of relentless combat, but determination etched deeply into his features. "My men are ready to move north immediately, General. If we keep pushing, we might catch Yuan's forces before they can fully regroup." Caldwell nodded approvingly. "Good. Take your infantry regiment and General Lee's Korean units as your vanguard. Advance quickly but cautiously. We don't know how many reinforcements Yuan or Mikhailov might have brought up." "What about General Okada and his Japanese divisions?" Harris asked thoughtfully. "General Okada will take a parallel route northeast toward Tokchan," Caldwell explained decisively. "We'll maintain two fronts, forcing Yuan and Mikhailov to stretch their lines even further. If we time this correctly, their defenses should collapse entirely." Harris saluted sharply, knowing clearly the gravity of the assignment. "Understood, sir. We'll depart within the hour." October 13, 1898. Near Suncheon, northward advance. Early the next morning, Captain Harris led his weary troops northward along muddy roads, flanked by Korean soldiers under General Lee. Morale was cautiously optimistic following their victory at Pyongyang, but fatigue was evident in every step the soldiers took. The countryside showed stark evidence of the rapid Chinese-Russian retreat. Abandoned artillery pieces, supply wagons overturned in ditches, discarded uniforms and equipment littering the roadways. Harris's men scavenged useful ammunition and supplies wherever possible, replenishing their depleted reserves. As they approached the outskirts of Suncheon, scouts hurried back from forward positions, breathless and urgent. "Captain Harris," reported Sergeant Lewis, his eyes wide. "Enemy units spotted just ahead. Chinese infantry setting up defensive positions on the northern edge of the town. They've positioned machine guns and artillery, and they're digging trenches as fast as they can." Harris quickly surveyed the terrain. Suncheon stood as a strategic crossroads, and securing it would allow his forces to continue advancing swiftly. But the enemy clearly understood its importance as well. "Relay orders immediately," Harris commanded firmly. "Deploy artillery batteries to target enemy trenches. Infantry will follow closely behind the barrage. We have to break their defenses quickly." "Yes, sir." Lewis saluted sharply, sprinting off to relay orders minutes later. Amorathian artillery fired its first volley, shells whistling high overhead before crashing violently into the hastily fortified Chinese positions. Explosions sent enemy soldiers scattering, smoke billowing into the gray sky. "Advance!" Harris shouted clearly above the echoing artillery blasts. Amorathian and Korean infantry surged forward, rifles at the ready, sprinting quickly through fields and roads toward enemy lines. Enemy machine guns rattled harshly, cutting into advancing troops, but the fierce artillery bombardment steadily disrupted their defensive cohesion. The initial engagement was savage, soldiers clashing directly in enemy trenches and across open fields. Harris fought alongside his men, leading charges into enemy positions, rifle fire ringing sharply in his ears. By late afternoon, the town's defensive perimeter collapsed. Enemy troops retreated once more, withdrawing hastily northward toward Unju, pursued relentlessly by Amorathian and Korean forces. October 14, 1898 Takshan. Eastern Front simultaneously, General Okada's Japanese divisions pushed aggressively northeast, rapidly advancing toward Takshan. Okada's infantry moved methodically, carefully clearing enemy pockets of resistance along the route, supported by precise artillery barrages. Late in the afternoon, Okada personally led a decisive assault on Takshan's outskirts, swiftly breaking through enemy lines weakened by days of retreat and relentless pursuit. Within hours, Japanese soldiers secured the town center, capturing dozens of Russian soldiers and substantial supplies. At the captured Russian command post in Takshan, Okada studied fresh maps and captured documents, recognizing immediately their strategic value. "Send this intelligence to General Caldwell immediately," Okada ordered his adjutant sharply. "He needs to know that Yuan's forces in Unju are more vulnerable than we anticipated. They have fewer reinforcements than expected." "Yes, sir." The adjutant replied swiftly, hurrying off to dispatch messengers southward toward Pyongyang. October 15, 1898 Amorathian headquarters. Northern Pyongyang. General Caldwell received General Okada's intelligence reports in the late evening. He examined the information carefully, realizing clearly its strategic implications. The enemy was weaker and more fragmented than previously believed, presenting a rare opportunity. "Grant," Caldwell said urgently, looking up from the documents, "tell Captain Harris and General Lee to immediately increase pressure toward Unju. Okada's intelligence indicates Yuan's defenses there are fragile. This could be our best chance to break their northern line completely." Colonel Grant quickly dispatched orders northward, recognizing clearly the urgency of the moment. October 16, 1898 near Unju. Chongchon River. Captain Harris's forces approached Unju carefully in the pre-dawn darkness. Guided by detailed intelligence reports provided by Okada's captured documents, Chinese and Russian troops had hastily constructed defensive positions along the Chongchon River banks, desperately hoping the natural barrier would slow the advancing Amorathian and Korean troops. At first light, artillery batteries opened fire precisely, shells crashing into enemy defenses along the riverbank. Infantry quickly moved forward under the protection of the barrage, carefully crossing bridges and shallow river crossings under heavy enemy fire. Machine guns and rifle volleys echoed fiercely across the riverbanks, soldiers from both sides falling steadily in the brutal exchange. But Amorathian and Korean forces pressed onward relentlessly, determined to breach enemy lines. By late morning, several key positions along the Chongchon River fell to advancing Amorathian troops, forcing enemy units to retreat yet again. Harris moved forward cautiously, surveying the battlefield grimly. "Push onward," Harris ordered firmly, urging his weary men forward once more. "We can't let Yuan regroup, keep pressing until Unju is ours." His men moved out immediately, determined despite their exhaustion. Every soldier knew clearly the stakes. Unju's capture would isolate remaining Chinese and Russian forces in northern Korea, effectively ending their coordinated resistance. October 17, 1898 Presidential Palace, D.C. Amorathia President Matthew Hesh reviewed new dispatches quietly, deeply relieved. Collins entered cautiously, observing Matthew's expression. "More victories, sir?" Collins asked gently. Matthew nodded slowly, determination etched deeply in his face. "Harris and Lee have reached Unju's outskirts. Yuan's forces are in full retreat northward again. We've nearly regained complete control." Collins relaxed visibly, then victory seems within reach. Matthew exhaled deeply, aware of the heavy price already paid. We're close, but the final push northward may be the toughest yet. Tell Caldwell to keep the pressure constant. We can't let them escape again. Understood, sir, Collins replied immediately, moving swiftly to relay Matthew's unwavering resolve. Chapter 285. October 18, 1898. Outskirts of Unju, Chongchon River line. A chill hung heavy in the early morning air as Ameranthian and Korean troops gathered at their positions south of Unju, their breath visible in the faint dawn light. Captain Edward Harris watched his men quietly, studying their faces. Exhaustion lined their expressions, but determination shone through clearly. Weeks of continuous combat had forged these soldiers into hardened veterans. Still, the looming battle for Unju would push them to their limits again. Unju was critical. Its bridges, roads, and railway lines represented vital arteries feeding enemy forces further north. Securing the city would effectively sever General Yuan Shirkai's retreat and isolate thousands of enemy troops. But Yuan knew it as well, and the city was now heavily fortified. General Lee Sang-hoon approached Harris, adjusting his overcoat against the biting morning wind. Captain Harris, Lee said steadily, my scouts confirm enemy defenses along the southern approaches are formidable, multiple trench lines, machine gun nests, and barbed wire fortifications. Harris nodded grimly. We expected heavy resistance. Any signs of artillery? Yes, they've reinforced positions along the heights north of the city, Lee replied calmly. Russian guns, heavy calibers likely positioned to control river crossings and major roads. Harris considered this carefully, glancing back at his troops. Then our artillery must be precise. If we can't neutralize their guns quickly, our infantry will be exposed to devastating fire. General Lee agreed solemnly. I've instructed my artillery commanders to target their gun emplacements immediately upon engagement. We'll coordinate our barrages closely. A young runner approached hurriedly, saluting sharply. Captain Harris, sir. Message from General Caldwell. General Okada's Japanese divisions have secured Takshan and are swinging west toward Unju. He requests we launch our attack immediately to pressure enemy positions from the south. Harris felt a brief surge of encouragement. Okada's timely push from the east could force Yuan into a desperate defensive fight on two fronts. Understood, Harris replied firmly. Inform General Caldwell we're commencing our attack at once. The runner departed swiftly, leaving Harris and Lee exchanging silent, meaningful glances. Each understood clearly what the next hours would demand. 0800-hour southern approach to Unju exactly on schedule. Ameranthian and Korean artillery batteries opened fire simultaneously. The sudden roar echoed harshly across the frozen landscape, shells screaming overhead to crash violently into enemy trenches and fortified gun emplacements. Explosions erupted in fiery blooms, scattering earth, debris, and enemy troops skyward. Harris stood slightly behind the frontline trenches, binoculars pressed tightly to his eyes. Smoke obscured much of the battlefield. But the effect of the initial barrage was evident. Several Russian artillery positions fell silent immediately, their crews decimated or guns disabled. Advance. Harris ordered sharply, lowering the binoculars. Instantly, hundreds of Ameranthian and Korean infantry surged forward, sprinting quickly across open ground toward the first enemy trench line. Machine guns rattled harshly from surviving enemy positions, bullets cutting through advancing soldiers in grim swathes. Casualties mounted rapidly, but the troops pressed relentlessly forward, determined to breach the defenses. General Lee moved beside Harris, issuing rapid orders to his infantry units. Forward quickly. Don't let their machine guns regain their advantage. Soldiers scrambled into enemy trenches, engaging in brutal, close-quarter fighting. Rifle butts smashed fiercely, bayonets clashed desperately, and the chaos of battle quickly engulfed the southern outskirts of Unju. Enemy reinforcements from deeper defensive lines rushed forward, attempting desperately to regain lost ground. Harris recognized immediately the critical moment. Bring up reserves now, he ordered sharply to his adjutants. We must exploit this breach. Fresh Ameranthian troops surged into the fray, reinforcing the initial assault waves and gradually overwhelming Chinese and Russian defenders caught off guard by the relentless pressure. After nearly 2 brutal hours of fighting, the initial trench lines fell completely, leaving surviving enemy troops retreating hastily towards secondary defenses closer to Unju itself. 10:30 hours Unju command post, Chinese-Russian forces inside Unju. General Yuan Shirkai struggled to maintain order as scattered reports of disaster flooded in. Enemy forces had breached his initial defensive line far faster than anticipated, and the eastern flank was already buckling under Japanese pressure from Okada's rapid advance. General Alexei Mikhailov entered abruptly, frustration visible in every step. General Yuan, he said urgently, our defenses won't hold much longer. Amorathian and Korean infantry have breached our southern perimeter, and Japanese divisions under Okada have engaged our forces east of the city. We're rapidly becoming encircled. Yuan clenched his fists, forcing calm into his voice. What about the bridges and rail lines north of the city? Can we still withdraw if necessary? Mikhailov shook his head sharply. Retreat now is perilous. Amorathian artillery already targets our escape routes. If they cut off Unju entirely, thousands of our troops risk entrapment. Yuan exhaled slowly, recognizing clearly the dire reality they faced. Then we hold Unju at all costs, issue orders immediately, consolidate our remaining divisions into tighter defensive positions around the city's center. We'll make them fight street by street if necessary. Mikhailov saluted grimly, departing swiftly to relay urgent orders. 1500 hours southern outskirts of Unju. By afternoon, Amorathian and Korean infantry penetrated deep into Unju's outer districts, securing neighborhoods block by block amid fierce resistance. Enemy defenders clung desperately to remaining strongpoints, fighting stubbornly despite encirclement. Harris personally led several assaults, directing his soldiers carefully through urban streets littered with rubble and burning debris. Sniper fire echoed sharply, machine guns chattered relentlessly, and artillery continued bombarding remaining enemy positions within Unju. As Harris paused briefly to reload, General Lee approached urgently, his face grimy with smoke and dirt. Enemy forces are pulling back further northward, consolidating positions near the city's railway depot and main bridges. Harris nodded, breathing heavily. Then we must press harder. If they regain defensive footing, retaking Unju will become impossible. Suddenly, from the east, distant explosions echoed harshly. Japanese artillery had finally arrived, engaging remaining enemy positions from a second direction. Harris felt immediate relief. General Okada's arrival significantly increased pressure on Yuan's troops. Push forward now, Harris commanded resolutely, rallying soldiers forward again. Amorathian and Korean infantry surged forward once more, supported by precise artillery fire that steadily demolished remaining enemy resistance. 1800 hours, Presidential Palace, D.C. Amorathia President Matthew Hesh quietly studied the latest dispatches from Unju. His heart heavy yet hopeful. Collins stood nearby, awaiting his reaction carefully. Matthew finally looked up, determination clear in his eyes. Unju is nearly ours, he said steadily. Enemy resistance is collapsing. Yuan's forces are retreating again northward, this time toward Manchurian border positions. Collins exhaled in quiet relief. Then our counteroffensive is succeeding? Matthew nodded slowly, careful with his words. We've regained the initiative fully, but Yuan and Mikhailov still command significant troops northward. This war isn't finished yet. Collins nodded solemnly. I'll inform General Caldwell immediately. Matthew turned back toward the window, gazing thoughtfully toward the darkening city skyline. Unju represented another hard-fought victory, but each victory came at immense cost still. For the first time since the war's brutal beginning, Matthew sensed clearly that total victory was finally within reach. Chapter 286. October 24, 1898. Yalu River Valley. Northern Korean front. A bitter chill descended over the Yalu River Valley, the harsh northern wind carrying the unmistakable scent of gunpowder and burnt earth. Captain Edward Harris adjusted the collar of his heavy woolen coat. Feeling exhaustion weigh heavily upon his shoulders, his troops, together with their Korean and Japanese allies, had relentlessly pursued General Yuan Shirkai's retreating forces northward from Unju for nearly a week now. Finally, they stood at the very doorstep of the Yalu River, the natural boundary between Korea and Manchuria, the last critical obstacle before ending this grueling war. The enemy, desperate and cornered, had entrenched themselves firmly along the riverbanks, constructing intricate defensive lines. Chinese and Russian soldiers now occupied fortified trenches, bunkers, and artillery emplacements designed to halt the Allied advance. To Harris, the sight was both daunting and strangely encouraging. These final fortifications represented Yuan's last stand, the final hurdle before victory. General Lee Sang-hoon approached quietly, stepping carefully over frost-covered earth. Captain Harris, Lee began, his voice steady despite obvious fatigue. Our forward scouts report the enemy has concentrated the remainder of their artillery along the northern banks of the Yalu. They're determined to stop us here. Harris nodded solemnly. They know crossing the river means their defeat. General Yuan is putting everything he has left into this fight. Li exhaled, a faint mist forming before his face. Our soldiers know this too. They're tired but morale remains high. We believe we can break their defenses. Good, Harris replied firmly. We'll need every bit of determination today. As the two commanders spoke, General William Caldwell arrived on horseback, escorted by Amarathian staff officers. He dismounted quickly, his expression tense yet resolute. Caldwell wasted no time, addressing both Harris and Lee directly. Gentlemen, the enemy is cornered, but desperate. Our Japanese allies under General Okada are already moving into position further east, preparing to assault the enemy's flank across the Yalu near Uiju. We must pressure Yuan's forces directly here and force them into an impossible choice: retreat across the river under fire or surrender. Harris studied the general carefully, hearing the urgency behind Caldwell's measured words. What are your orders, sir? Caldwell unfolded a detailed tactical map, laying it carefully atop a nearby wooden crate. He pointed precisely at enemy positions along the Yalu. Captain Harris, you'll lead the frontal assault. Heavy artillery will precede your advance, targeting enemy guns first to neutralize their firepower. General Lee, your Korean divisions will support the flanks, preventing enemy reinforcements from reinforcing the front lines. Understood, General? Lee replied immediately. Harris nodded in agreement, eyes fixed firmly on the map. We'll advance as soon as the artillery barrage concludes. Exactly, Caldwell responded sharply. Once Yuan's forces begin pulling back toward the river, General Okada's Japanese troops will strike their eastern flank, catching them in a pincer. Harris exchanged glances with Lee, both understanding clearly the magnitude of what lay ahead. This battle along the Yalu would decide the war's final outcome. October 24, 1898. 0700 hours southern bank of the Yalu River, precisely at 7 in the morning. Allied artillery unleashed a devastating barrage against enemy positions across the river. Dozens of heavy cannons thundered simultaneously, the echo reverberating sharply through the icy air. Shells screamed overhead, detonating with frightening accuracy against Chinese and Russian trenches and gun emplacements. Explosions shredded defensive fortifications, obliterating bunkers and scattering enemy troops in chaos. From his command position just behind the frontline trenches, Harris observed the carnage through binoculars. Enemy artillery fell silent almost immediately, their crews and guns torn apart by the overwhelming bombardment. Infantrymen huddled nearby, gripping rifles tightly, preparing mentally for the coming assault. Finally, after nearly 30 relentless minutes, Caldwell signaled to Harris, "It's time, lead your men forward. Advance." Harris shouted, rising immediately from cover. Thousands of Amarathian and Korean soldiers surged forward, sprinting toward hastily erected pontoon bridges spanning the freezing river. Enemy rifle fire cracked from surviving trenches, bullets whistling dangerously close, but the massive Allied infantry wave pressed relentlessly onward on the eastern flank. Lee's Korean divisions surged into enemy flank positions, their rifles and bayonets driving back desperate Russian reinforcements. Attempting to halt Harris's advance further east, distant explosions confirmed that General Okada's Japanese troops had launched their assault on Yuan's vulnerable eastern lines. Enemy resistance intensified sharply near the river's northern banks. Chinese soldiers fought fiercely from heavily fortified positions, machine guns rattling desperately to halt the relentless advance. Harris, leading personally from the front, felt a bullet strike his shoulder but pressed on, urging his men forward. With renewed urgency, October 24, 1898, 1,200 hours northern bank of the Yalu River. After hours of fierce fighting, Amarathian infantry finally established a bridgehead on the Yalu's northern bank. Chinese and Russian defenders pulled back slowly, reluctantly abandoning their fortifications under heavy pressure from multiple directions. Yuan's troops now faced a stark choice: retreat hastily into Manchuria or surrender on the spot. From his new position on the riverbank, Harris observed enemy soldiers retreating northward, many abandoning their weapons and equipment in their panic. General Caldwell soon joined him, binoculars raised. "They're breaking," Caldwell muttered tensely. "We have them. Keep pressing forward, Captain." Harris saluted sharply, rallying his weary but determined troops once more. "Forward quickly. Do not give them time to regroup." Allied infantry pressed northward relentlessly, capturing thousands of fleeing enemy soldiers who surrendered rather than continue their hopeless flight. General Yuan, desperate to avoid complete disaster, ordered his remaining divisions into an immediate withdrawal toward Manchurian territory, attempting a controlled retreat under near-constant artillery bombardment. October 25, 1898, Presidential Palace, D.C., Amarathia. Late in the evening, President Matthew Hesh stood silently by his office window, reading the latest telegram from Korea. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts, and Collins entered quietly. "Sir," Collins said carefully, sensing the gravity of the moment. "Has there been a significant development?" Matthew finally turned toward Collins, allowing himself a brief, weary smile. "Our forces have crossed the Yalu River. Yuan's army is in full retreat into Manchuria." Collins exhaled in visible relief, "Then victory is near." Matthew nodded slowly, cautious despite the good news. "Near but not yet complete. Yuan still commands substantial forces and diplomatic channels remain delicate, but we've achieved a critical breakthrough." Collins straightened respectfully. "Then I'll ensure General Caldwell has everything he requires to finish this." Matthew gazed thoughtfully at the quiet city beyond. For the first time since the war began, genuine peace seemed within reach, but one final step remained. The next battle would determine not only the fate of this war, but perhaps the future stability of East Asia itself. He turned back toward Collins, voice firm and determined. "Inform Caldwell clearly. End this war quickly, decisively, and permanently. Whatever he needs, Amarathia will provide." "Understood, sir," Collins replied solemnly, departing to relay Matthew's decisive message. Alone again, Matthew stood silently, staring northward, knowing clearly the stakes involved. One final push and victory awaited. Chapter 287. The Final Stand. October 30th, 1898. Outskirts of Dandong, southern Manchuria. A freezing mist hung heavily over the outskirts of Dandong, clinging to the trees and buildings as if trying desperately to conceal the scars of warfare. General Yuan Shirkai stood silently atop a small rise overlooking the city, watching his exhausted troops establish hurried defenses. Behind him lay the battered Yalu River, now controlled entirely by Amarathian, Japanese, and Korean forces, who were relentlessly advancing northward into Manchuria. Yuan's breath clouded softly in the cold air as he surveyed the bleak horizon. Dandong represented his final position. Further retreat was impossible without surrendering Chinese territory. He could feel the weight of history pressing upon his shoulders. This battle was not merely about military victory or defeat. It represented China's pride, sovereignty, and future standing among world powers. Colonel Deng approached slowly, his face pale from weeks of relentless combat and retreat. "General Yuan," he began respectfully, "the defensive preparations are underway, but morale is dangerously low. Ammunition and food are dwindling, and reinforcement from Beijing is unlikely." Yuan nodded slowly, his expression resolute despite the dire circumstances. "We cannot allow the enemy to march unchecked through our territory. The Emperor has ordered us to hold Dandong at any cost." Deng hesitated slightly before responding, clearly uneasy but determined to speak truthfully. "Sir, the men are aware this may be their last battle. They're prepared to fight, but many question whether our sacrifice will truly make a difference." Yuan turned sharply toward Deng, his voice firm but tempered with understanding. "Tell the men their courage and determination matter now more than ever. The world is watching. Even in defeat, honor and strength must prevail. We must prove that China will not surrender without exhausting every possible effort." Deng saluted quietly, absorbing Yuan's words with visible respect. "Understood, General. I'll relay your message clearly." Yuan returned his gaze toward the distant horizon, watching carefully as enemy scouts appeared cautiously along the far ridgeline. "Ensure our artillery positions are concealed until the last moment. Let the enemy think our defenses are weak when they advance. We'll make them pay dearly." "Yes, General," Deng acknowledged firmly, departing swiftly to deliver orders. October 30th, 1898, afternoon. Southern approach to Dandong. Captain Edward Harris led his Amarathian infantry slowly forward. Flanked closely by Korean soldiers under General Lee, their advance had slowed as Chinese resistance hardened significantly around Dandong. Enemy rear guards conducted skillful delaying actions, forcing Harris's troops to clear village after village. Each fiercely defended despite dwindling supplies and manpower. Harris knelt behind a low stone wall, studying enemy positions through binoculars. Chinese soldiers had entrenched heavily around the outskirts of Dandong with multiple layers of trenches. Machine gun nests and artillery concealed expertly behind buildings and natural cover. General Li moved quickly alongside him, his face tense. Their defenses look stronger here than we've seen since Pyongyang. General Yuan clearly intends to make his final stand in Dandong. Harris nodded grimly. Yuan knows retreating further means surrendering Chinese territory. He'll fight harder now than ever. This battle could be the toughest yet. Artillery Captain James McAllister joined them hurriedly, pointing urgently toward distant buildings. Sir, enemy artillery is well concealed, but we've identified several positions through scouts. Our guns are ready, just give the order. Harris glanced briefly at Li, who nodded in silent agreement. Commence artillery fire immediately. Target their heavy artillery first. Once they're suppressed, infantry will advance under smoke cover. McAllister saluted quickly, rushing back to relay orders. Moments later, Amorathian artillery thundered loudly, shells arcing high overhead before exploding violently across suspected Chinese positions. Smoke and debris quickly filled the air, obscuring visibility in every direction. October 30th, 1898, evening central Dandong. Under the heavy cover of smoke, Harris and Li led their soldiers directly into the outskirts of Dandong. Battling fiercely through narrow streets and alleyways, the city erupted into chaotic, brutal combat as enemy defenders resisted fanatically, firing from buildings, rooftops, and barricades erected hastily across key roads. Bullets and shells screamed violently through crowded streets, explosions tearing buildings apart and sending debris scattering dangerously. Harris fought alongside his men, clearing buildings room by room, each step paid for dearly with blood and courage. To the east, General Okada's Japanese divisions pressed aggressively into Dandong's eastern districts, encountering equally fierce resistance. Japanese soldiers engaged in savage house-to-house combat, their disciplined training proving critical against entrenched defenders. Slowly, painfully, Allied forces converged upon the city center, methodically overwhelming isolated pockets of resistance. Each captured position, however, revealed horrific casualties on both sides, reflecting clearly Yuan's determination and desperation. October 31st, 1898. Morning Central Square, Dandong. By dawn, Allied forces had advanced within sight of Dandong's Central Square, where Chinese defenders made their last desperate stand around fortified buildings and barricades. Captain Harris and General Li moved cautiously, their troops exhausted but resolute. Suddenly, rifle fire erupted sharply from entrenched defenders. Harris and his men dove for cover, returning fire immediately. Machine gun bursts shattered windows and walls, cutting down soldiers unfortunate enough to be exposed. We need artillery support now, Harris shouted desperately, waving toward distant artillery observers. Moments later, shells exploded directly across enemy barricades, temporarily silencing machine gun fire. Harris seized the brief lull, urging his men forward once more. Charge now. Take the square. Amorathian and Korean soldiers surged forward courageously, sprinting directly across open ground under heavy fire. Enemy defenders, exhausted and nearly out of ammunition, finally began surrendering or retreating hurriedly northward. By late morning, Harris's troops secured the central square, raising Amorathian and Korean flags prominently above captured enemy positions. Chinese resistance finally crumbled entirely, remaining soldiers retreating chaotically or laying down their weapons. November 1st, 1898, Dandong, Chinese headquarters. Inside the battered headquarters building, General Yuan Shikai sat quietly, surrounded by his surviving officers. Colonel Deng approached slowly, his expression subdued but respectful. General Yuan, Deng reported solemnly, the city has fallen completely. Our remaining forces are retreating northward, but morale has collapsed. Continued resistance is futile. Yuan exhaled slowly, absorbing the painful truth. Order our remaining troops to withdraw northward in good order. Our fight ends here, but China must survive beyond this defeat. Deng saluted quietly. Departing swiftly to deliver final orders alone, Yuan stared silently at battle maps now meaningless, recognizing clearly the historical consequences of this defeat. November 2nd, 1898, Presidential Palace, D.C. Amorathia President Matthew Hesh read the telegram carefully, feeling a surge of profound relief. Sir, Collins asked carefully, noticing Matthew's expression, is it finally over? Matthew nodded slowly, allowing a cautious smile. Dandong has fallen. General Yuan's remaining forces are retreating northward into China. He is effectively defeated. Collins exhaled sharply, visibly relieved. Then it's over at last. Matthew looked carefully toward Collins, his voice tempered with understanding. The fighting has ended, but now begins the harder task. We'll negotiate a peace lasting enough to prevent another war. Understood, sir, Collins acknowledged quietly, departing to relay Matthew's intentions clearly. Matthew stood silently by the window, contemplating carefully the immense price paid for this victory. Peace had finally arrived, but he knew clearly the work of rebuilding, diplomacy, and securing lasting stability had only just begun. Chapter 288. November 5, 1898 Seoul, Korean Royal Palace War Council Room. The Great War Room inside the Korean Royal Palace stood unusually quiet. Sunlight poured in through the tall stained glass windows, casting long beams across the polished floor. The war maps that had once overflowed with pins, markers, and hurried scribbles were now sparse, their clutter replaced by measured calm. General William Caldwell sat at the head of the council table, the deep bags under his eyes betrayed weeks of sleepless nights and unrelenting decision-making, but today there was a glimmer of peace behind his gaze. Beside him sat General Lee Sang-hoon, upright and poised, while General Haruto Okada of the Japanese Imperial Army reviewed the latest reports with a subtle nod. The room was filled with officers from all three allied nations. For the first time since the outbreak of war, no one was shouting. No one was pressing for more supplies, and no one had to rush to the front. The final battle at Dandong was won, and now came the aftermath. Caldwell broke the silence. We have received formal confirmation from the Amorathian delegation in Beijing. General Yuan Shikai has officially been recalled. The Qing government has ordered a ceasefire. They are requesting negotiations. Murmurs rippled through the room. General Lee was the first to respond. Does this mean it's over? No more northern offensives? No more push deadlines? It means the fighting stops, Caldwell replied. For now, a delegation representing the Qing Empire and their Russian counterparts will meet us at the neutral zone on the Yalu River on the 8th. General Okada folded his hands together. And what of the Russians? They've withdrawn back to their Manchurian strongholds, Caldwell said. Their general, Mikhailov, informed us through an intermediary that Russia will participate in the talks, but only as an observer. Lee exhaled deeply. Typical. Caldwell continued, regardless of their position, the Chinese have effectively admitted defeat. Their armies are in disarray, their supplies exhausted, and public support is crumbling. If we apply pressure diplomatically, we can dictate the terms. A Korean officer raised a hand. And Seoul? Will the Japanese and Amorathian units remain? Caldwell looked around the room. For now, yes, until a formal treaty is signed and enforced. After that, we'll begin phased withdrawals. General Okada gave a small bow. We will leave it to your country's sovereign discretion. General Lee, Japan has no desire to stay longer than necessary. Lee nodded with quiet gratitude. Caldwell then opened a folder in front of him. There's one more matter. The Korean royal family has requested that we host a public celebration and ceremony commemorating the victory and honoring our alliance. Tomorrow? Lee asked, raising a brow. Caldwell smiled slightly. Yes, the people need to see us united not just in war, but in peace. Okada agreed, a symbolic gesture, one that will echo through generations. Caldwell stood eye. Then let's give them something to remember. November 6, 1898 Seoul Gyeongbokgung Plaza. The streets of Seoul had not seen celebration in years. Now, colorful banners of Amorathia, Korea, and Japan hung together above the plaza. Thousands gathered near Gyeongbokgung Palace. Children perched on rooftops. Women in hanboks waved paper flags. And old men who had lived through other wars clutched each other's arms and wept. It was not just a celebration of victory. It was relief. It was survival. Amorathian soldiers marched through the streets. In ceremonial uniform, their polished boots struck the ground in unison as they passed the crowd. Faces proud, shoulders straight. Behind them came the Korean Royal Guard in gleaming armor, followed by the disciplined columns of Japanese infantry. General Caldwell, General Lee, and General Okada rode side by side on horseback, the crowd erupting into applause as they approached the palace steps. President Matthew Hesh had arrived earlier that morning via Amorathian warship and was now present on a raised platform alongside the Korean king and Japanese dignitaries. Dressed in a formal black coat, Matthew looked every bit the wartime president turned peacemaker. He stood to address the massive crowd. My friends, my allies, and my fellow guardians of peace. He began, his voice amplified by a brass megaphone. We stand here not merely as soldiers of three nations, but as brothers in shared sacrifice. Cheers roared through the plaza. We fought not for conquest, not for empire, but for freedom, for the right of every nation here to exist without fear, to choose its own future, to resist the tyranny of aggression. The Korean king stood next, his words solemn yet grateful. This alliance has preserved our nation. My people will never forget the bloodshed to defend our lands. We will honor the lives lost by ensuring peace reigns once more." Then came General Okada, who kept his speech short. "Let this victory remind the world. Unity brings strength, and mutual respect brings peace." The national anthems of all three countries played, and as the final notes echoed into the open sky, doves were released over the crowd, thunderous applause followed, and Seoul erupted into celebration. Vendors lined the streets, giving away rice cakes, tea, and sweet jellies. Children ran through the alleys with toy rifles carved from wood. Pretending to be heroes, soldiers laughed, danced, and embraced the locals, finally shedding the tension of constant war. Captain Harris stood near the palace gates, his uniform dirted, his cap tucked under one arm. A Korean girl handed him a flower. He blinked, surprised, then smiled and tucked it behind his ear. "Guess I'm not such a terrible guest after all." Nearby, General Caldwell watched the crowd with quiet contentment. For all the planning, the losses, the impossible decisions, this moment, he felt, was the closest thing to justification. He turned to Lee and Okada. "We still have work ahead, but today, let's let our people celebrate." Lee clapped his shoulder. "You earned this." Okada offered a rare smile. "We all did." That night, fireworks lit the Seoul sky. No orders, no battle cries, just color and light. It was the first night in months where no soldier slept with a rifle under their arm. It was the beginning of something new, and across the sea, in Amarathia, families wept with relief, reading headlines of peace, and in China, emissaries prepared for peace negotiations they could no longer stall. The war was ending, the dawn had arrived.